more a study of the life of Jacob. We have looked at Isaac's life, and from this point forward, it's really all about Jacob. And for much of what we've looked at up to this point, it's been a lot more about Jacob than it has been Isaac. And so it's been several weeks since we've looked at Genesis, and so it's necessary to have a little bit of review. So Jacob has successfully stolen the birthright blessing from his brother Esau with the help of his mother Rebekah. Now this birthright blessing was his from the very beginning by declaration of God the Father when Rebekah was pregnant with the twins. Isaac was overwhelmed with fear, knowing that he had sinned against God and was unable to bless his favored son after learning that he had in fact blessed Jacob instead of Esau. Esau was enraged at learning that his brother had stolen the blessing and was now breathing murderous threats against Jacob. And Rebekah was in fear for Jacob's life, learning of Esau's plans. And she creates a plan to send Jacob away to her homeland to find a wife from within her own family. So she said she's going to send Jacob away to go to her brother Laban in the region of Padan Aram. And so Jacob is not to marry a Canaanite woman, just as Abraham had instructed Isaac, and just as Esau has himself done. He's married 2 Hittite women, and after learning of Isaac's instruction to Jacob not to marry a Canaanite woman, Esau then goes out and marries from the tribe of Ishmael to spite his father Isaac. So before Jacob leaves on this nearly 1,000-mile journey back to Padan Aram, he receives the blessing from Isaac, which is the same blessing that Isaac received from Abraham, which Abraham received from God. So in a sense, Jacob is in exile, an outcast from his own family, loved only by his mother. Now, Rebekah mistakenly thinks that this is going to blow over quickly. Jacob will find a wife and return home, and everything will go back to normal. And by the way, normal in this family is very, very dysfunctional. But Jacob is not going to return home for nearly 20 years. And in fact, we will not hear anything about Rebekah when we pick up the story when Jacob does return home in some 20 years. There's only a mention of Rebekah's handmaid, Deborah, who mentions the fact that Rebekah has died. So there's no mention of Rebekah, Jacob's mother, when he in fact returns home. So we're going to pick up the story in Genesis 28, verses 10 through 22. Jacob meets God. This is a life-changing event for Jacob. His life will never, ever be the same. So read with me in verses 10 through 22. It's a very lengthy passage. There's a lot in here, and it really could be divided up into 2 messages, but I didn't want to do that. And it's just hard to divide, so we're going to do it in one message. Picking up in verse 10, then Jacob departed from Beersheba and went toward Haran. He came to a certain place and spent the night there because the sun had set. And he took one of the stones of the place and put it under his head and lay down in that place. He had a dream, and behold, a ladder was set on the earth with its top reaching to heaven. And behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And behold, the Lord stood above it and said, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie, I will give it to you and to your descendants. Your descendants will also be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. And in you and in your descendants shall all of the families of the earth be blessed. Behold, I am with you and will keep you wherever you go and will bring you back to this land. For I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. Then Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it. He was afraid and said, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. So Jacob rose early in the morning and took the stone that he had put under his head and set it up as a pillar and poured oil on its top. He called the name of that place Bethel. However, previously, the name of that city had been Luz or Luz. Then Jacob made a vow, saying, if God will be with me and will keep me on this journey that I take, and will give me food to eat and garments to wear, and I return to my father's house in safety, then the Lord will be my God. This stone which I have set up as a pillar, this will be God's house, and of all that you give me, I will surely give a tenth to you. Now, there is a lot in here, and we really could spend a lot of time unpacking it all, but I'm going to go through this as quickly as I can for reasons that I hope will be evident as we get through this. The first thing we're going to look at here, letter A, is Jacob flees. He doesn't just leave, Jacob flees, remembering that Esau, his brother, is breathing murderous threats against him. Verse 10 says, then Jacob departed from Beersheba and went toward Haran. In fear for his life, Jacob leaves home. He has little more than the clothes on his back and perhaps whatever he could carry on the back of an animal. Jacob, the mama's boy, is not a hunter, is not really a scavenger, leaves home. He has no entourage like Isaac's or like Abraham's servant had when he went to find a wife for Isaac. We're not told of a large contingency of supplies. We're left with the impression that Jacob leaves with almost nothing, and he is absolutely alone. He leaves Beersheba, which is Isaac's headquarters, if you will. It's his main city. And he's leaving for Haran, which was Abraham's main city. And he is leaving alone. Haran and Padan Aram are in the same region, and Moses, the author, is tying these two cities together with some flair. Jacob is making the journey that Abraham did, but he's making it in the opposite direction. If you remember, when God called Abraham, he left Haran and went to Canaan, and now Jacob is making that same journey and going backwards, making that journey in reverse. We come to verse 11. He came to a certain place and spent the night there because the sun had set, and he took one of the stones of that place and put it under his head and laid down in that place. So night has fallen, and Jacob's first day of travel has come to an end. When night fell, you did not travel. It was not safe. You couldn't really see unless there was a full moon. It was very, very dark in these desolate places. There were not street lights. There were not ways to travel at night. So his first day of travel has come to an end. He's likely leaving at midday, perhaps later. He's not gotten very far, but he's out of the city and he's on his own. With no place to stay, he camps outside under the stars in a certain place, and he has nothing to use for a pillow except a small, smooth stone that he puts under his head. Now, the location is a mystery until it gets revealed for us in verse 19, when it's revealed and it's renamed. But until then, it's left as a mystery to us, and it's only named as a place or a certain place, and it's referred to 3 times as a place. We're told later that it's Luz or Luz, and it will be renamed Bethel, and we'll talk about that when we get there. Second thing we see here is letter B, Jacob's dream. Now, much has been made of this dream, especially the first part of verse 12, but to understand that, we must understand it both in the context of Jacob's life and the biblical revelation as a whole. You can't look at just verse 12a and create a doctrine out of that. You can't do that. You have to look at Jacob's life and the biblical revelation as a whole. So we're looking at Jacob's dream, and there's 3 parts to this dream. The first part is what he sees. We see this in verse 12 and in 13a, the first half of verse 13. He had a dream, and behold, a ladder was set on the earth with its top reaching to heaven, And behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending on it, and behold, the Lord stood above it and said. That's the first part of this dream, what Jacob sees. Now, this is far and away the most fascinating part of the entire passage that we're looking at, and it has led to an enormous amount of speculation. It would take far too much time to explain all the positions on what this represents. There have been a number of positions that have been put forth in Jewish tradition, rabbinic tradition, ancient church history positions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and we would get lost in what some of the positions have said over the years of several thousand years of history, both in Jewish history and early Christian history. But let me begin by saying this. This is a theophany, an appearance of God in the form of a dream. It is God's way of revealing himself to Jacob and teaching Jacob what God wants Jacob to learn. That's a very narrow focus of what this means. It's God appearing to Jacob to teach Jacob what he wants Jacob to learn, and then that very narrow focus has to be understood in the context of the biblical revelation as a whole. We can't take every theophany of God and make a doctrine out of it. We have to understand them for what they are designed to teach the whom that God appears to. It's very, very important that we do that. If we don't do that, then we scramble with a bunch of doctrines that won't make sense in the biblical revelation of a whole. It's very, very important to remember that. So we're looking at the very first part of this, what Jacob sees. There's three parts to what Jacob sees: the ladder, the angels, and the Lord. So let's look at the ladder. This is far and away the most important or the most fascinating part of what Jacob sees. The ladder, or the stairway, represents divine presence and mediation between God and the earth. In other words, it's the mediation between God and man. Now, this is not a literal ladder, but a metaphorical one that indicates that man is not alone on this earth, that God himself, sometimes in the form of angels, mediates on behalf of man. That's the first thing that Jacob sees, is this ladder or this stairway that indicates that God in heaven mediates on the earth. That's what that represents. We'll talk more about this at the end of the message. I don't want to deviate from that because we get lost on the rest of what we're going to talk about. So more on that later. The second thing that Jacob sees are the angels. So in Genesis, angels are messengers sent by God. What we've seen so far in Genesis is that angels have three primary purposes. They are messengers sent from God to guard, like they did in the Garden of Eden when they guarded the tree of life. The second thing is they are sent to communicate, like they did when the three men appeared to Abraham and told him that he's going to give birth to Isaac. And then they're also sent to protect, like when they appeared in Sodom and Gomorrah and they protected the house when the men were trying to storm and take advantage of the virgin women. You remember that story. So those are the three primary purposes that we've seen from angels in the book of Genesis. Now, we know this from the biblical revelation as a whole, not just in the little bit we've seen in Genesis. What we've seen in the biblical revelation as a whole about angels is this, Hebrews 1:14. Speaking of angels, are they not all ministering spirits sent out to render service for the sake of those who will inherit salvation? So this is the role of angels in the entirety of the biblical revelation, to render service for the sake of those who will inherit salvation. So what Jacob sees is this ladder that indicates divine mediation between God and man, sometimes by God himself, sometimes in the form of angels, where they are ministering spirits between God and man. That's what he sees. The constant flow of angels represents divine presence and mediation. It shows how God is constantly mediating on behalf of man, either himself or in the form of angels. And this is what Jacob can expect. We should be careful not to make too much of this. We should not create a doctrine from one part of this one verse. We should not expect that these angels ascending and descending on this ladder means more than what it represents right here in this very narrow focus theophany to Jacob. Let me just say that. We're going to move on. The third part of what he sees is the Lord. The Lord stands above the ladder, and the flow of angels indicates that he sovereignly rules over the angels, over their ascending and descending, and that the Lord rules over both heaven and earth. This is what Jacob sees. Now let me pause right here and let me ask you this question. Do you think Jacob has a crystal clear understanding of what this means? Absolutely not. He has no idea what this means. But this is going to set the course for what Jacob is going to learn over the course of his life. This is why God is showing Jacob this and what he's going to see. Now, the second part of the dream is what Jacob hears. The second part of verse 13 and verse 14 is what Jacob hears. Here's what God says. I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie, I will give it to you and to your descendants. Your descendants will also be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. And in you and in your descendants shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Now, we've heard this promise said over and over again to Abraham a number of times. It's been repeated to Isaac. We've heard it, we know what it means, and now we hear it repeated to Jacob. The title God uses for himself here is found only here in all of the Old Testament. There are variations of this title used in the Old Testament, but as it is said here, exactly as it's said, is said only here in the Old Testament. By saying it this way, the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac, and then repeating the covenant promise to Jacob, what it is saying to Jacob is that you, Jacob, are included as a patriarch over the future nation of Israel, just as Isaac and just as Abraham are. In fact, Jacob's name will later be changed to Israel, and he will be called the father of Israel. So this is incredibly important for Jacob because he has heard this covenant promise repeated by his father Isaac probably hundreds of times, but he has never ever heard this promise repeated to him by God himself. This undoubtedly has captured Jacob's attention like nothing else in his life ever could or ever would. The same promise made to Abraham and made to Isaac has now been made to Jacob. The promise of land, the promise of numerous descendants, and the fact that his descendants will be a blessing to all the families of the earth. That was the promise made to Abraham in the very beginning of Genesis 12. It was the same promise repeated to Isaac, and now it's been promised to Jacob. A notable difference here is that his descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and they will expand to the north, to the south, to the east, and to the west, everywhere in all directions. Something that was not said to Isaac or to Abraham. Now, the third part of this dream is, in fact, the most important, and that is what it means. This is, in fact, the most important part. Jacob does not understand what this means, but again, this is what he is going to learn over the course of his life. Verse 15 says, "Behold, I am with you and will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you." Now, what God says in verse 15 is implied in verses 12 and 13, but what God says in verse 15 is unique to Jacob. He did not say this to Abraham, and he did not say this to Isaac. He did not say this even though it was true for Abraham and Isaac. What he says here is entirely unique to Jacob. God makes 3 personal promises to Jacob in verse 15. And that's what this dream actually means. Letter A, I am with you. Jacob needs to know that, because Jacob's life is about to get really, really hard. In his mind, he's going to Padan Aram to get a wife, right? And his mother said, you're going to go there and you're going to come back and everything is going to be fine. But we've read the story. We know what's going to happen, right? He's going to be there for 20 years. His uncle Laban is going to deceive him and mistreat him for 20 years. Jacob needs to know that the God who has revealed himself in this dream has made a promise, I am with you. The second promise that God makes here, letter B, I will watch over you. This is a promise of protection and preservation. Now, I don't know what you feel when you're going through very, very difficult, very unwanted, and very unwelcome circumstances, but more than likely you have either thought or said, God, what's going on? God, what's going to happen? God, where are you? I don't like this. Have you left? Have you forgot about little old me? Jacob needs to know that God is watching over him. And that's what this dream is really all about. God makes this promise, I will watch over you, and it's a promise of protection and preservation. The third promise God makes is, I will bring you back. As much as it might feel like your life is going to end where you are, it's not. I am going to bring you back where you are, where you have had this life-changing experience with me. I'm going to bring you back. You're fleeing for your life as an outcast from your family, and you're going to feel absolutely alone where you are, but I'm going to bring you back to your family. This is what Jacob needs to learn from what it is he's seen and what it is he's heard. And what God says in this promise is what all of that has meant. God summarizes these personal promises at the end of verse 15 by saying, I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. That doesn't mean that God is going to leave him after he completes the promises. It is God's way of saying, I'm here to the very, very end. You can count on what I have said. Now remember this. This is very, very important. Where is Jacob in his life? in his walk with God. Jacob's walk with God is non-existent. He is a conniving, deceitful, manipulative, dishonest sinner on the run for his life from his family, and this is his first personal encounter with God, and this is what God has shown him and told him and promised him. What Jacob saw in the angels ascending and descending the ladder, in the Lord standing over the ladder, is his assurance that God is going to be with him and watch over him and bring him back home. His theophany was unique to him, and it was exactly what he needed to see and hear and learn so that he would have a life-changing walk with the Lord. Now, I'll say this. When I had my life-changing experience with the Lord, you could have been exactly where I was and left and said, that was interesting. Didn't mean much to me, but that was interesting. It changed my life. It began my journey with the Lord. My experience would not have been your experience. You could have been sleeping next to Jacob in that spot and not seen or heard what Jacob saw and heard. It was unique to Jacob. Now, letter C in our outline is Jacob's response to this encounter that he had with God. There's three responses that we're going to see here. The first one is fear and awe, verse 16 and 17. Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, "Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it." He was afraid and said, "How awesome is this place! This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven." So Jacob awoke from his dream and was in a state of both fear and amazement. He found himself in the presence of God in a place he least expected. He's simply laying in this desolate place with his head on a rock, and he found himself in the presence of God. We have to remember, Jacob knows that he is a deceitful, conniving, manipulative, sinful man, a dishonest sinner on the run for his life. And the last thing that he ever expected was an encounter with a living God. He draws two conclusions from this dream, both of which are wrong. But he has no basis for this understanding. He thinks that God lives in this very spot, and that in this very spot is the gateway to heaven. In modern vernacular, he thinks that this is a magical portal into heaven. And he can come back here anytime and see a literal ladder with literal angels ascending and descending into heaven and look up and see God. Well, he's never going to see that again, but that's his understanding, but it's not accurate. Remember, there is no temple, there is no centralized place of worship. There are altars scattered around Canaan where Abraham and Isaac have had encounters with God and put up these altars as memorials for these encounters. But this is a special place for Jacob because this is where he had an encounter with God. This is his perspective. For Jacob, this is where God lives, and this is where there's a gateway into heaven for Jacob. In reality, the house of God, his presence, the gateway to heaven is everywhere. But that's not Jacob's perspective. It's right here in this spot. Somehow, some way, after Jacob awoke from his dream in fear and in awe, he either fell asleep again or lay there for hours, but we have a second response, and that is the response of worship. Verse 18, so Jacob rose early in the morning and took the stone that he had put under his head and set it up as a pillar and poured oil on its top. This is an ancient way of worshiping. He took that stone, we have no idea how big it was, comfortable enough to be a pillow, I guess, But he takes that stone and he stands it upright and pours oil on it, and that is his pillar as a remembrance of his encounter with God, where God appeared to him. And then he goes one step further in verse 19. He called the name of that place Bethel. However, previously the name of the city had been Luz or Luz. That name Bethel means house of God. And it will always serve as a reminder of God appearing to Jacob. And so for Jacob, that place became Bethel. And when he would return in 20 years, that place was still called Bethel. The third response that Jacob had is he makes a vow. Now there's disagreement about this vow amongst scholars and commentators regarding this vow. Some contend this to be a conditional vow from a sinful, conniving, manipulative, dishonest Jacob who has had this encounter with God, and he's going to test God because he says, if you will, then I will. Others contend that Jacob is making a vow of faith based upon what he has seen and heard, because a vow is a commitment that results from a life-changing encounter with God. And this should not be read as a conditional if-then situation. But here's the vow that Jacob makes in verses 20 through 22. Then Jacob made a vow saying, if God will be with me and will keep me on this journey that I take, and will give me food to eat and garments to wear, then I will return to my father's house in safety. Then the Lord will be my God. This stone which I have set up as a pillar will be God's house, and of all that you give me, I will surely give a tenth to you. So there's the disagreement then. This is either a conditional vow or a commitment vow. But his vow contains three requests which flow directly from the promises that God makes. His requests are, letter A, God's protective presence. God told Jacob, I am with you. Jacob says, keep me safe like you promised. Letter B, the request is for divine provision. God says, I am with you and will keep you, meaning he would protect and provide for him. Jacob says, feed me and clothe me as you promised. Now, what I think is interesting here is that Jacob didn't ask for riches. He didn't ask for wealth. He didn't ask God to restore the wealth that he was leaving. He asked God to feed and clothe me as you promised. Letter C, he asks for safe return home. God promised, I will bring you back to this land. Jacob says, bring me back to my father's house like you promised. If God does what he said he would do, then Jacob's vow contains three corollary promises to the promises that God made to him. Letter A, devotion to the Lord. You will be my God. Dedication to the Lord, which is seen in the setting up of the pillar. He erects a rudimentary house of God for future worship. And letter C, offering of a tithe. No longer is Jacob grasping what he can. Remember, Jacob means grasping the heel. But now he is promising to give back to the Lord, giving a tithe of all that he might accumulate on the journey and when he returns. Remember, Jacob has absolutely nothing, and he will know that everything that he will eventually possess can only be attributed as a provision from God. So together, these three promises mark the beginning of a transformation in the life of Jacob. Now, it could be conditional in the life of a newly transformed, deceiving, manipulative, conniving, dishonest man, or the life of a man who has been transformed by what he has seen and heard. We don't really know. But what we do know is life is going to get incredibly hard for Jacob, and he is going to have to lean upon what he has seen and what he has heard. But no doubt, this experience has forever changed the life of Jacob. Now, earlier I spoke about the ladder or the stairway that Jacob saw coming down from heaven, which represents God's presence and mediation between God and man. I want to take a few moments, I want to expand upon it because this is incredibly important. And I think it's very, very significant that we understand that, not just from what we've looked at from Jacob's perspective, but also from the biblical revelation as a whole. What Jacob saw was an image of the dynamic, gracious work of God in his life, that which he did not yet understand, but also in the lives of sinful people in a sin-sick world. While this was not a real ladder with real angels, it depicts a real work of God who is constantly mediating in the lives of sinful people like Jacob and like me and like you, calling us to salvation, fulfilling his promise to be with us, to provide for us, to protect us. Jacob's ladder is best understood as a type of Christ's mediatorial position connecting heaven and earth. This work of mediation may be aided by angels, but Jesus was and is the focus of that divine ladder. The New Testament revelation of this is truly amazing. Look at this. In response to Nathanael's faith early in the ministry of Jesus, Jesus said this in John chapter 1. Jesus answered and said to him, "Because I said to you that I saw you under the fig tree, do you believe? You will see greater things than these." And he said to him, "Truly, truly, I say to you, you will see the heavens opened and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man." What do you think that is a reference to? Do you think that is not a reference to Jacob's ladder where the heavens opened and the angels were ascending and descending on the earth? Jesus doesn't reference a ladder, but there is no doubt that that reference is very, very clear in the thinking of a Jewish person who would know very, very well the story of Jacob's ladder and all of the theories that have been proposed about what Jacob's ladder meant and what it represented. When Jesus said, "Truly, truly," it calls us to pay very careful attention to what he says here. So when Jesus says this, it puts the focus of Jacob's ladder squarely on himself and not upon Jacob. And he designates himself as the Son of Man. The title of the Son of Man is incredibly important because it speaks of Jesus as the incarnate human life and also of his preexistence. It is a messianic designation used 82 times in the Gospels, and 81 of those times it is used, Jesus uses that title for himself. As the incarnate Son of Man, Jesus is the true Jacob, the true Israel, and the one upon whom the angels ascended and descended as seen in his life, death, resurrection, and his ascension. Jesus took his designation as the Son of Man from the vision that is recorded in Daniel 7, which describes his ultimate sovereignty. Look what it says here in Daniel chapter 7, verse 13 and 14. I kept looking in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, one like a son of man was coming, and he came up to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion, glory, and a kingdom, that all the peoples, nations, and men of every language might serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which will not pass away, and his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed. This is the one upon whom the angels ascended and descended, and this is the one upon whom the focus of Jacob's ladder truly rests. The Son of Man mediates the work between heaven and earth. As Paul said to Timothy in 1 Timothy 2, verses 5 and 6, for there is one God and one mediator also between God and man, the man Christ Jesus, who gave himself as a ransom for all. Christ, our Son of Man, is everywhere at all times, hearing our prayers and mediating the work of heaven on our behalf. Think of this. He is at both ends of the ladder, as Jehovah at the top and as Jesus, our salvation, at the bottom. The old Bethel, the house of God, has been superseded. It is no longer in Bethel where God reveals himself, but it is in Jesus Christ. Likewise, the temple is obsolete because Jesus is the temple, and that temple resides in the life of every believer, you and me. There is nowhere we can go where he does not mediate between heaven and earth for us. Everywhere we go is the house of God, and everywhere we go is the gate of heaven. All of this is the awesome, enormous work of grace, and when we think of Jacob's ladder, we should think of Jesus Christ, the ultimate and the only mediator between God and man. What Jacob saw is the type of Jesus Christ himself. Do not create a doctrine out of Jacob's ladder. See the fulfillment of Jacob's ladder in the work of Jesus Christ on the cross, his ascension back into the heavenlies, his finished work in you and I, those who know him as Lord and Savior. That is what Jacob's ladder is all about. Amen? Let's pray. Father, how we give you thanks for the great God that you are, this amazing work that you have accomplished on our behalf. And I will be the first to say that it is an ever-growing work in our understanding. How we give you thanks for the scholarship that helps us learn more about who you are and what you've done.